Hello and welcome to the launch of South Africa's first ever four-way multi-fusion. I'm your host, Josephine Byers, CEO of the Publisher Research Council. I realize you have had a very long year and Zoom fatigue is real. So thank you for choosing to spend the next hour with us. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the first for South Africa, a fusion of 4 sets of data to give you media planners, strategists and marketers access to triple the data points available in any other survey. By combining PAMS, TAMS, CPS and DPS, we're able to illuminate quadruple the insights ever seen before in audience measurement surveys in South Africa, with over 950 million data points, over 2,000 brands across 199 categories. Just before we kick off, allow me to reveal what's been brewing at the PRC. As we embark on the next era of audience measurement, it is my pleasure to now introduce our brand new, digitally relevant and refreshed PRC logo, a circle of life that represents the earth with all its rich possibilities. I'm going to take this opportunity to acknowledge and thank our hybrid marketing agency, Twisted Toast, for creating this elegant evolution of the PRC, as well as the Fusion identity and all the expertise behind the scenes to bring you this virtual launch today. So let's kick off with a little of the recent history of the PRC and the BRC working together on the establishment survey to give the industry an alternative to AMPS. While the ES has now come to an end, our partnership lives on in TAMS, using PAMS as the TV universe, and now collaborating on Fusion in the spirit of doing what's best for the industry and providing the best possible insights to planners and advertisers. Fusion is undoubtedly the way forward. And so we follow on from the pioneering Fusion work done by the PRC and Nielsen in 2018 and continue our collaboration together with the BRC in this first for South Africa, a 4-way Fusion. So allow me to introduce each of the 4 surveys in the Fusion. Of course, we have PAMS as the hub, and we'll continue and tell you a little more about TAMS, CPS and DCS as we go along. But most of you are familiar with PAMS, the Publisher Audience Measurement Survey, which is the most complete measurement of reader audiences across all platforms to inform your effective advertising investment. It's a geographically national survey. It's household flooded to 15,250 respondents with face-to-face CAPI and obviously random probability. We cover all 233 municipalities. And it's the first survey in South African media history to have income in the sample design using the Neighborhood Lifestyle Index developed by GTI. The PAMS 2019 sample was disproportionately designed by income. Upper income areas were disproportionately oversampled and lower income areas were disproportionately undersampled. So without further ado, I think what I will do now is next up, thanks to our partners at the Broadcast Research Council for embracing this era of collaboration to illuminate more insights than ever before. Allow me to introduce the BRC CEO, Mr. Gary Whitaker.
Thank you, Josephine. I'd really like to echo your sentiments before I go into TAMS and what it's all about. The BRC is extremely excited to be working in collaboration with the PRC and Nielsen in order to bring this fused data set to the market. The BRC and its members are fully committed to working together with any and all industry partners, so long as we're meeting the needs of the entire marketing and media industry. Working together means we can only thrive and we all win. So let's go into TAMS. So TAMS is our premier linear TV currency in South Africa, and it consists of over 3,000 households, which are nationally representative and represent roughly almost 16 million TV households in South Africa. And essentially, we measure linear TV with the aim of going into other forms of video viewership, but that's for another conversation. Recently, we partnered with the PRC on our universe update, and that is an indication to all of you that we at the BRC are fully committed to collaborating with, again, any industry partners, as long as we're meeting the needs of the entire industry, as opposed to any one sector. Thank you.
Privileged to be spearheading this evolution with you. It's our hope that other JICs will follow suit and that South Africa will follow the footsteps of other progressive nations with further collaborations for the good of our industry, especially after this year of unprecedented challenges for our entire sector. So next up, let's invite our research partner, Nielsen's MD, Terry Murphy, to tell us a little bit more about CPS and DCS. Welcome, Terry.
Thanks, Josephine. It's great to be all with you today. And Nielsen and we at Nielsen are thrilled and beyond excited to be the provider of the fusion services on this project, which we think is a really great industry first, going to benefit everyone hugely. And the other thing I'd like to do is introduce two of the Nielsen surveys which have been fused into the PANS and TANS data to make it the four-way fusion. One is CPS, or Consumer Panel Services, which gives information on brand and product consumption across South Africa. And the second one is our Digital Consumer Survey, which is part of a global survey run in many countries. So if you just put the presentation on, I'll take you through that. Okay. Right, so starting off, Consumer Panel Services it's a home panel, much like TANS. I'm just trying to go to the next slide, but my option is blocked. Excuse me, guys. Thank you. All right, so it's a 4,000 strong panel in South Africa. It's a little bit bigger than TANS, and I think Peter might have calculated that it delivers something like 68 million data points. So we collect data out of the survey all through the year continually. We've taken the period of 12 months to February 2020, which was specifically collected or specifically chosen to be outside of the COVID period, where both supply chain disruption to supermarkets was happening, and so people couldn't get everything they wanted, and also avoiding the very obvious COVID lockdown, atypical purchase and consumption habits which would have happened. So this data is relevant post-COVID and into the future, which is great. It is full national, demographically and geographically representative of the full country, and it is audited actual consumption. Now this, we need to draw the distinction, and this is why we're so excited about it, because it's unlike a survey where there is claimed memory-based consumption of product. This is actual audited purchases of goods and products from any retailer that have come into the home and consumed. And because of that, we have a very good idea of the exact volumes of consumption, the sizes of packs, and so on, so we can categorize users into heavy, medium, and light consumers of the brands. Right, next slide. Right, so in the CPS data, we captured 199 categories of FMCG products and over 6,000 brands in total. What we bring into the fused data are the brands that have a sample that is big enough to be included into the fused data. So that would be brands with a sample of over 40, which makes them relevant and robust enough to include. And then in terms of categories, you'll see a slight decrease in the categories from 199 to 191. And that is because what we do purposefully is we exclude cigarettes, alcohol, and some of the baby products, because those categories aren't well represented in only the in-home consumption, because they happen to be largely out-of-home consumption brands too. All right, The other nice thing about the data is that it is used already. Many of the big FMCG providers subscribe to the data globally. And so bringing this data into the survey data means that what they're looking at in the survey data set is congruent with what they have in their own in-house workings in their marketing department, which is a big first, because that doesn't necessarily happen with surveys that are like AMPS, where we saw differences between what they see and what we question. All right, so it's been running, it's a big global study. It's running in many countries, 24 countries, and I think it's been running for roughly 20 years. So it's really solid data in over 230,000 households all over the world. All right, next slide, please. Okay, what do we do? How's it done? We have auditors that capture data at 4 points, which is how we get it to be such a thorough and comprehensive collection of actual products purchased and consumed. Firstly, what we do is the auditors scan what the panelists have produced in terms of a diary of barcodes upon purchase. The second thing we do is we capture all till receipts. We then audit pantry to double check that against the first two things. And the last thing we do is we go through the disposed packaging from products that have already been consumed, and our auditors literally have a Nielsen dustbin where they then tally up what's been disposed of, what's been consumed, and so on. Okay. The Digital Consumer Survey, we love this one. It's our brand new data that's just come out of field. We were in field in July and August this year. We also chose this fieldwork period to be out of the heavy lockdown period where we saw really significant disruption in overall media consumption patterns. And TV was really up. Anyway, we looked at the period very carefully and looked at it across the global community too. And what we see at the point of July and August is kind of a new normal where we have higher digital consumption patterns, significantly higher than they were 2 years ago when we last ran this survey. And you can go to the next slide, please. All right, so this is questions asked of an online panel, which is 3,000 respondents. So it's nice and robust for an online panel. And you qualify for being a digital consumer by having internet consumption or access to the internet in the last week. And it's again nationally, full national, 15 years and older. And it measures all digital usage across platforms and information about online behavior. Now, importantly for this, like TAMS, the digital consumer behavior uses PANS as its establishment survey. So it's really nicely lined up in the data. Okay, what does it give you? It gives a lot of information. It gives information not only about digital consumption, it measures the digital consumers against both their print, online and paper versions of newspapers and magazines. It also looks at radio consumption online as well as versus traditional broadcast. It looks at TV viewing behavior, both online in terms of streaming activity as well as linear consumption on normal TV platforms. Then it looks at VOD platforms and brands. It looks at contents and the types of contents and programs watched by people. It has a lot about internet technology in households, and then it moves into podcasts and social media. And lastly, it gives a very good idea of a frequency of consumption in terms of place and device. And then it has a very nice day in the life of section, which chops up the day parts into morning, day, sort of lunchtime, afternoon, and evening media consumption. And what we've done is we've used those day parts to fuse back into the other media types, so TV, radio, print also, so that we can see which media types are the hero of the morning, lunchtime, afternoon, and so on. So we'll have a look at that a bit later. But I'm going to now hand over to Jonathan Wells, who is our international head of data science. And he is going to talk us through what Fusion is, how it works, and how this particular Fusion has been handled.
Thanks, Terry. Hello, everybody. It's such a privilege to be back working with this community again, albeit I am dialed in at the moment from Tampa, Florida. It's very early in the morning here, but this is a great way to start my day. Before I get started, I did want to set maybe just a little bit of context around what it is that we're going to be talking about today. If you think about it, single source measurement, panels, diaries, surveys, have really been the backbone of the market research industry for really the 20th century. We measure activity in a small subset of the population, and then we project that out against a universe estimate. These data sources are really good and very valuable because they give us the advantage of being able to directly tie media exposure and consumer behaviors to deep and rich demographic information. But here's the problem. The number of paths that consumers can take to consume media and to purchase products has expanded exponentially in the last 20 years. All of the various permutations and combinations of consumption make traditional single-sourced survey-based measurement much, much more difficult. Why is that? Well, it's because if we expect people to record everything that they do for us, it's a really big ask. It's hard to remember everything that you did, and it's very time-consuming and puts a burden on the panelists. So if we're going to rely on traditional research methodology, as media continues to fragment, we need to ask more questions to understand the complexity of behavior, the complexity of brands. And when we ask more questions, basically that puts a higher burden on the respondent themselves. And that leads to fewer respondents, and it actually starts to undermine the quality of the responses that they give. So it gets harder and harder for individual data sets to give us pervasive measurement. Think of it like this. Given all of the choices that people can make today, how likely are we to observe a specific combination of exposures and actions directly in a single sample? We end up with a limitation in coverage. Yet we all have the same measurement need. Advertisers, planners, publishers, broadcasters, all still want to know what people are consuming, what products they buy, and what activities and services they use. But here's the good news. We're living in an information age. There are a multitude of data sources that are available, panels, surveys, and the emergence of big data all help us to capture a piece of the puzzle. As a market researcher, my challenge lies in finding a logical and a robust way to bring that information together and build a complete view of the individual. So let's open up some slides and take a look at this in a little bit more detail for you. So what is a fusion? At its core, fusion is a statistical process of merging two or more different data sets at the respondent level in order to create something that really ends up being greater than the sum of its parts. It gives us a single database, which enables us to cross-analyze an individual's purchase intentions and habits with their media consumption of print, of digital, and of TV media. At the same time, and very importantly, the fusion maintains the integrity of the currently available currency data for both TV and print, without putting an increased burden on the respondent to answer more and more questions. Fusion has a number of different uses across a number of different industries, and it's been used in market research really since the late 80s. It's the advance of computer technology that's really allowed statisticians to build more sophisticated and robust fusion algorithms, and that's what's really brought fusion into prime time. Before we get into the technical details, I thought it might be useful for us to step through a really simple example to help you to sort of visualize what the fusion is trying to achieve. Some of you may have seen these slides before, but I think it's a really helpful refresher for us in today's conversation. So let's imagine that I want to know how many people watched a particular game that was broadcast on TV, and also how many people bought a particular brand of soft drink. Now, the TAMS panel that comes from the BRC can certainly tell us who saw the game. The Nielsen consumer survey that Terry talked about can also tell us who bought the soft drink, but neither study can tell us who did both. So how can fusion solve for this? Well, let's break it down. On the top row of this chart, you can see a representation of the information that we get from TAMS. And it shows us on the left-hand side that 3 people meter respondents watched the game. And you can also see that 4 people did not watch the game. On the bottom row, you see a representation of our consumer purchase panel. 4 respondents bought the soft drinks and 3 did not. So how do I understand the intersection of these 2 activities? Well, let's assume that the color coding on this page represents the particular characteristics of each respondent across the 2 data sets: their age, their gender, where they live, and a range of other definitional characteristics. Now, a keen eye will start to see some relationships or common characteristics that exist across the TAMS and the CPS respondents. Let's focus on the demographic characteristics represented by the green and the yellow profiles. So with the fusion, if those characteristics, if I use those green and yellow characteristics as a matching criteria, what you can see is that we have 2 matched profiles that both watched the game, which you can see represented on the left-hand side, and bought the soft drinks on the right-hand side. So by matching those respondents with similar characteristics across the 2 data sets, we start to get an appreciation of how many people, and more importantly, who undertook both activities. Now, if that were all there was to it, I'd be done with my presentation today and would be able to move on. But it's going to come to as no surprise to any of you that Fusion 2020 is a little bit more complex. So let's spend a bit more time getting into the science behind the fusion so that you really have a better understanding, not only of the power of this product, but also the credibility and the robust nature of the outputs and the analysis that it produces. So some key takeaways on this slide. The first thing that I want you to all take away from today is that fusions are not built based on finding the same individual respondent or the same person across 2 data sets. Indeed, as we just saw in our example, the core underpinning of the fusion is the assumption that human behavior is largely predictable, that people with similar characteristics behave in very similar ways. Now, there's a lot of statistical research behind that assumption. And in fact, if you think about it, it is the foundation of any sample-based measurement system. The key to the fusion is really about understanding which characteristics are the best for predicting those behaviors. So the fusion process starts with 2 data sources. One we define as a donor who is going to transfer all of their information to the recipient. After that initial integration is done, we can then add more and more data sets to create a much larger and richer set of information. Fusion relies on what we call very carefully selected hooks, also referred to as linking variables or matching variables. And these are the things, the attributes that best predict the individual's behavior. On the diagram, these hooks are represented by the intersection of the red and the gray circles. Now, these variables are the basis for deciding which respondents in the donor survey are the closest in profile and behavior to those in the recipient survey. There's a couple of things to remember as we think about these linking variables or matching variables themselves. First, obviously, they have to be good predictors of behavior across both data sets, whether that be, in our case today, purchase behavior or TV viewership or internet usage or print readership. They also need to be very well matched across the 2 surveys and not statistically redundant, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The selection of the linking variables begins with a very basic analysis of sample sizes, of profiles on the donor and the recipient databases. And that helps us to identify all of the potential common variables that we may have access to. When we assess whether those hooks, then what we do is to assess whether those hooks satisfy 2 criteria. Are they complete? Do they tell us everything that we need to know? And are they congruent? Do they line up? Are they something that can actually be associated with one another? Once we validate that these variables are statistically significant, then the hooks are used to match those respondents. And that allows data from the donor survey or the donor database to be transferred onto the recipient. Once we've done that, we've now got a complete view of a respondent, albeit a virtual one. Now, there are a few different flavors of fusion to talk about. There's a one-to-one fusion that you may hear reference to, where there is only ever a single match between an individual donor and an individual recipient. There's also a one-to-many fusion, when individuals may be matched multiple times on either the donor or the recipient side based on our requirements. And I'm going to come back to that in a little bit later on this morning to really explain why we might need to do this and what that means for the data and for the outputs. I may have made the cardinal sin. There we go. Okay. So, as you heard Josephine say in our introduction, Fusion 2020 is a little bit more complex than even the example that we talked about previously. It doesn't use 2 data sources. Rather, it's the first 4-way fusion that's used for media research in South Africa. This means we have 4 data sets that we're trying to integrate. Now, when you set up a fusion, the first thing that you need to do is decide which data sets will be the donors and which data set will be the recipient, because you only ever have one recipient database. In the case of Fusion 2020, we determined that PAMS would be the recipient data, or the hub, because of its very robust base. It has a very large sample with over 15,000 respondents, but more importantly, the PAMS survey is very, very comprehensive. And that means that it already has most of the variables that we will need, variables that are in fact common across all of the other data sources. And that's really important, as you can appreciate, if we want to try and start matching based on characteristics. So because we've got all of those variables already contained within the PAMS survey, this increases the number of hooks that we can use, and that therefore improves the output quality of the fusion itself. So with PAMS established as the recipient, or the hub, the first thing that we did was to take the TAMS data that Gary has talked about already today, which is the red circle on this slide. Let's go, was that me? There we go, sorry. The red circle on this slide. We fused TAMS to PAMS using hooks like the type of pay TV service available or subscription available in the household. The gender, the age group of the household recipients, household income, and a number of other things. Now this is, as I've mentioned earlier, one of those many-to-one fusions. Individual PAMS recipients are matched to multiple TAMS donors. This process actually results in an increase in the number of fused respondents, which I hope you can see now, which takes us from the 15,000 respondents in PAMS up to a total of 24,000 respondents, 24,500 respondents in the fused database. Again, I'm going to come back in just a minute to why this happens and why that's an important thing to understand. So the next thing that we do is to take the CPS panelists, the yellow circle here, and then fuse that onto the combined database. This is now a one-to-one fusion, and we use things like newspaper readership, internet usage, even things like the proximity of the household to a post office or a police station, because we know that those kinds of things can influence the sorts of behaviors that we want to measure. So those are some of the flexibility that you see in the hooks that we use. And then lastly, the green circle, the Nielsen DCS survey, which Terry talked about, is fused using things like overall media consumption, internet usage on cell phones or computers or tablets, household size, presence of children, all of those other things that provide good indicators of digital consumption. So after the fusion, we now have a single respondent level data set that provides a very comprehensive view of media consumption patterns that can then be segmented across many different dimensions and audience characteristics in terms of the consumers themselves and what the consumers do in their day-to-day lives. So let's talk a little bit, let's come back to that notion of why does the respondent count increase? And this is a really important thing to understand, because as I mentioned, while the CPS and the DCS fusions were one-to-one, where we match individual donors to individual recipients, in the case of the TAMS fusion, we use this many-to-one fusion. And we do this for a very important reason. And that reason is that both the TAMS and the PAMS data sets are currency databases. And because they're currency databases, because we trade large volumes of transactions based on the data in those surveys, we need to make sure that we preserve that currency status within the final fused database output. So how do we go about doing that? Well, if you think of it from a TAMS perspective, we need to make sure that every piece of TAMS information is included in the Fusion. That means that every TAMS donor, every single recipient, and all of their information needs to be accounted for in the Fuse database. As we got deeper into that Fusion process and we started matching donors to recipients from TAMS to PAMS, what we found was that there weren't always enough best matches of the PAMS recipients or to the PAMS recipients, often because that best match had already been assigned to a previous TAMS donor. Okay, so you kind of run out of people for the TAMS panelists to match against. So as you can see in the diagram on the right-hand side here, the Fusion methodology allows us to do what we call fragmentation. We end up virtually splitting some of the PAMS respondents into multiple virtual panelists. And this is how we can ensure that there is a best match recipient for every TAMS donor. And in that way, the TV currency is preserved. But if we split those PAMS recipients, what does that do? How does that impact the PAMS currency? Well, in short, it doesn't. Because effectively what we end up doing is apportioning the weights of the individual PAMS recipient across their respective fragments. So again, look at the diagram, and what you can see if you focus on the red text is that Clara, who is the PAMS recipient, has an initial weight of 9,000 in the PAMS sample. And again, this is just an example for you to conceptualize what's happening. When we fragment Clara, or we break her out into some individual virtual components, we want to do that to make sure that we have best matches for 3 of the TAMS donors in particular. There you can see Larissa and Paulette and Charisse. I was very creative with the names today. When we do that, our Fusion engine effectively divides Clara's initial weight across each of those virtual panelists. So you can see that that 9,000 breaks down into individual weights of 3,000, 4,000, and 2,000. So by doing this, even though the number of respondents has changed effectively in the PAM sample by cloning these people, even though the number of respondents has changed, the sum of the weights of all of the respondents remains identical. And that's how we make sure that the PAMS currency is also maintained in the Fuse database. So I hope you've got now a little bit of a deeper understanding of the theory of Fusion and how we put all of this together. But let's cut to the chase. What you really want to know, I hope, is what you can actually do with all of this interesting data. So here we're looking at one of the types of analysis, and only one of the types of analysis that we can produce. And on this chart, we can see the incremental reach for purchases of a set of chocolate brands across a number of different types of media. Look at Lunch Bar on the left-hand side of this chart. You can see that 46% of purchases of Lunch Bar can be found and reached very easily through readership, right? So readers, 46% of Lunch Bar purchases are reading newspapers, magazines, and all those sorts of things, both online and on paper. But we also know that if Lunch Bar wants to build their reach and find more and more purchases, they can find an additional 37% of their audience using television. And then above that, an additional 6% can be found on social media platforms. Now, what's really interesting about the Fusion, particularly as you look across all of these individual brands, is that you can actually start to differentiate incremental reach by brand themselves. Look over on the right. Now, Lindt chocolate, it's a little bit more of a niche brand. But what you can see is a very different distribution in the column on the right-hand side. See how the social media incremental reach for Lindt is over 2 times higher than some of the larger, more mainstream chocolate brands. Here's an extension of the Lunch Bar analysis. We're now looking at reach by TV channel, broken out by time of day. SABC1 looks to be the best option to maximize reach for Lunch Bar purchases. But look at how DSTV, the yellow line towards the top of the screen, does a really good job of finding those purchases in the afternoon hours between 3 and 6 p.m. It's also not surprising to see that the reach numbers are lower for those channels that skew towards younger audiences. And the reason that the data would support that is that obviously in our purchasing models and in our CPS panel, children are not usually designated as the dominant purchasers within each household. The purchases are usually made by the adults. So the two examples that we just looked at were pretty obvious applications, I guess, of the fusion and looking across media at all of the information that we can get when we put this data together. But I also, excuse me, I also wanted to highlight just how flexible this solution really is. So what we're looking at here is a 360-degree view of an auto purchaser. From the PAMS database, we know that 3.5 million people purchased their current vehicles as new. So what else can the Fusion tell us about these people, about these consumers? Well, all of the percentages that you see highlighted in yellow show how many new auto purchasers consume the things that you see in the gray column on the left-hand side. So look at the broadcasters. Look at how those consumers or how those auto purchasers are consuming TV media. 52.6% of new car buyers watch SABC1, the national broadcaster. Now, that in itself is interesting, but what's even more interesting is when you start to compare that to the national average. The national average coming out of the TAMS rating service tells us that actually, compared to that 52.6%, new auto buyers are under-indexing on SABC1. The national average is actually 69%. Equally, on the other side, you can see that 55% of those auto purchasers watch DSTV. That compares against the national index of 42.2%. So we are over-indexing on DSTV. If you look at this through the lens of consumer purchasing, you find some other interesting things. So for example, here, you can see that 86% of new car buyers live in a household where instant coffee is purchased. If you compare that to the national average of 79%, you start to be able to create some really interesting relationships between consumers of different products. On the digital consumption side, you can see that 22% of new car buyers do online shopping during office hours, during the hours of 9 to 3 p.m. Now, again, this is really interesting because that 22.5% compares against a national average of people who are doing online shopping at that point in time by 12%. So you know you can go and find these buyers, these consumers on the digital platforms. What about readership? Well, the average number of paper print magazines read by new auto purchasers, you can see, is 2.04. Again, compare that to the national average of 1.54, and you start to get a really good sense, if I'm an advertiser or a planner, of where you will find the consumers that you are looking for. There's a lot more analysis that you can go into and many, many more things that Peter will talk about in a minute. But hopefully now you've got a bit of a sense of the power of the Fuse database and what you can actually do with it. So I thought I'd just take a minute to talk about sort of where we're going from here. Fusion obviously has been around for a while, and you heard me say that earlier. Nielsen's commercial use of the product really dates back to 1995, when we deployed what we referred to as the Panorama product in New Zealand. This was a fusion of TV ratings onto the local print data. Since then, we've grown our capabilities, as has the entire industry. Nielsen now has a dedicated global team who run commercial data fusions in North America, in Europe, in Asia Pacific, all over the world. And as you know, we've been successfully using Fusion as part of the PAMS and CPS product that we launched in South Africa 2 years ago. As the technique continues to expand its footprint, and particularly as the media industry in general focuses more intently on trying to understand cross-media exposure and how that leads to outcomes, purchase decisions, brand lift, things like that, what's happening is that the fusions continue to evolve. The techniques continue to evolve. And as with many things measurement related right now, we see the future of fusion centered around more sophisticated big data solutions, moving to more real-time information that incorporates a number of other what we call signals that we can draw from our data sets beyond just a static survey response. Longitudinal data is becoming increasingly important to identify trends and really start to look at the longer-term impact of things that help fill in some of the gaps that we often encounter when we're measuring media in an increasingly fragmented environment. Some of the techniques that we're incorporating through Nielsen's Fusion products and our data integration solutions include very scientific things like max entropy, Bayesian modeling, regression analysis, and a range of other things. And I really hope that we'll be able to talk more about those as Fusion 2020 continues to evolve in your market. Oh, let's go back. Can we go back just one more slide? Lost it. So look, before I wrap up and hand over to Peter, I just wanted to quickly summarize why we think Fusion is such an important part of the future to the media landscape. First of all, it's very cost effective and convenient. You don't need to run any additional primary research. It fits into existing analysis systems. You don't really need to buy any more software or create any more computing power. And most importantly, it continues to allow you to harness existing currency data so that that currency gets preserved and maintained, and all of the metrics that you're using to trade upon today are preserved. It's also something that gives you that respondent level flexibility. So even through the analysis that we just looked at, you can imagine that underneath all of that, we can get down to a respondent level understanding. And that gives us a very deep understanding of reach and frequency, and more importantly, where you can go to find the consumers and the users that you're looking for. It's a statistically precise solution. So, if you really get into the detail of what we're talking about, there is a lot of robust quality checks and reviews and validations that we do before any of this data gets released to you in the marketplace. And then finally, it obviously improves planning efficiency because you get to have everything in a single database. You don't have to spend time merging and integrating data across different sets. On behalf of Nielsen Media and my data science team, we're absolutely thrilled to be partnering with the PRC and the BRC on this initiative. And we're really looking forward to continuing to enhance and evolve media measurement in South Africa. Let me pass over to my friend and colleague, Pete Lunchmeer, who will take us through his part of the presentation. Pete, over to you.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. Thanks for taking the con out of Fusion. And to all those agency people who don't have colleagues who've seen this, we have recorded that particular session, plus we'll run workshops so you can explain to your colleagues. Okay, so I'm going to just close up with a smorgasbord of slides. And if we can just start off there. Okay, so what do you get in the Fusion? You get the platforms, TV, online, and TAMS. You get print, you get digital, you get radio. I'm going to go through these in detail. You get those products and brands, and we've chosen in PAMS, there are the categories that account for around about 85% of ad spend, and then the FMCG add another percentage. Okay, and then we've got people, LSMs, SEMs, analyze, and demos. Okay, moving along, in terms of the platforms, you've got the TAMS data, online TV, time shifted, over-the-top streaming, print, you've got paper and digital. Digital, you've got social media in there, you've got devices. We're going to look at a day in the life later on. And radio, you've got online streaming and normal live radio listening. Okay, in automotive, you've got the number of vehicles in the household, you've got personal ownership of the vehicle, you've got 56 makes of vehicle, and you've got whether it was obtained new or second-hand. In banking, we've got where accounts are held. We've got 11 financial institutions there. We also ask, what is your main bank? Once again, 11 there, and we've got credit cards. In cellular, number of cell phones in household, personal usage, type used most often, and you saw that picture earlier on, not earlier on, in previous presentations. The feature phone is almost dead. Smartphones are the name of the game, and you've got your network providers. Okay, next. Retail chains. We did a lot of work with the retailers initially. We don't ask frequency of visits, because you could go to the local spa 6 times a week and only spend 5 Rand. Retailing is all about share of customer. So we ask, where do you spend the most money, the second most, etc. We did do a presentation on food and grocery, and you can get that from the website that digs into the details of cross usage and the 2.7 stores that people go to. Because with food, all these retailers share customers, which is why they introduced loyalty programs. And when you're up against the Smart Shopper program, SPAR had to introduce it. Strangely enough, I used to work with Whitey Basson. He said, never in my life will we give away another 1%. We pass it on to the consumers. Sorry, you slip, you have to just go. Okay, so we're still on retail. And Yeah, Whitey's never gave it away. But when you're getting a club from a loyalty program with 12 million people, Checkers introduced one and they grew to 5 million faster than any other program. We've got furniture and appliance and clothing. And because store cards are so important, we're also asking store cards now. Okay. The people, you've got the LSMs, the SEMs, the demos, the geography, and the geo-segmentation. Now, the whole industry, you're very used to all those other measures. You're not that used to geo-segmentation. So I've slipped in one slide on geo-segmentation. And when you look at the neighborhood lifestyle index, and for anyone who wants, I've got examples of Durban, Cape Town, so you can see suburbs and areas that you know. This is for the people in Johannesburg, but you can see there right in the middle of Randburg, you get a neighborhood lifestyle index 5 right next to or adjacent a few hundred meters from a 10. So it's far more relevant from that perspective. And then you can see on the outskirts, you see the ones and the twos in Claremont as we move up that stage, or up north as you move to Blauwbosrand. So really excited about that. And Gordon Muller asked for not the broad groups, he asked for the individual 1 to 10s. So Gordon, it's on the survey. You can now look at 1 to 10s in terms of lifestyle index. Okay, very important for retailers. Right, bringing your customers to life. Jonathan touched on this. You can start off from the household. And as Josephine said, we've got 954 million data points. Just to put it in perspective, AMPS had about 350,000. So you've got almost 4 times more data sets, plus you've got longitudinal data. But if you were looking at the home, you could do the province, the community, the NLI, the SEM. In SEMs, you've got the number of rooms, the running water, the toilet. You can really bring alive their house. Have they got a motor car? Do they not have a motor car? What is it? The technology, the media audiences go into precise detail, as you know. What does a typical day look like? I'm going to show you that just now. The retailers, the brands, and who are they? The one part we were missing, and this is new that we're telling you about today, is we have just finished a study called MAMS, Media and Attitudes Measurement Survey, and that's got mindsets, values. I'll tell you a bit about that later on. So that's if you approached it from the household, if you approached it from the individual. This is from Consumer Scope, the consumer onion, and this is what these studies can do. It's not only for media planning, for those marketers out there. You can build an identikit of your customer, and that's what we're trying to do. What is their mind? Have they got a proclivity towards my brand or a predisposition towards my brand? That's what we're interested in. I don't give a damn what color you are, if you're old or young, if you're fat or thin. I'm not interested in your body. I'm interested in your mind, and have you got money? If you've got that, I will start advertising to you, and hopefully that will lead to shopping. So you get these layer upon layers that you peel back, and we've now got to that stage where we can do that again 5 years later after no AMPS. So this just gives an example of the mind, and I'm not going to teach the media planners to suck eggs, you know this, but just at a glance, we've got some education questions. And like in this case, you could see 1 in 4 FNB customers have any post-matric or university complete or postgrad, whereas only 1 in 11 Capitec have it. We ask influencer questions. There's 9 questions of keeping abreast and Facebook followers, and you can code 3 or more, 4 or more, etc. So there's all that in there. The average age, Capitec 35 versus 40, and as you know, the average age of a groom is now 37 years old. People are getting married a lot older, and the average age of a bride is 34. So if you had to look at single or married, you would then suddenly see 59% single on Capitec, etc. And you can see the language, Zulu, Xhosa, Sepedi, and with FNB, Zulu, English, and Afrikaans. Okay, so I'm not going to go through the whole enchilada, but you can do anything. We will also code the median LSM. And if your sample of your brand is not big enough to analyze, you can use that, and you could go 2 standard deviations either side, or say, from SEM 44.5 to 6.5, and you can then look at that as your day in the life. As I said, this is not only a media tool, this is total brand planning. So in the case of Capitec, 30% have a vehicle in household. With FNB, 54% have. So guess what? Your ATMs for Capitec are in major shopping centers next to ShopRite or Checkers, whereas with FNB, you'll find them at gyms, clubs, and restaurants. Okay, so that's just a bit on that. To finish off, well, we've still got one or two, sorry. From research to planning, both myself and Gary are ex-media directors. We know the pain that media planners go through. And your portfolios are much bigger than they used to be. You're planning on 50 million versus 20 million a few years ago. But it's been exacerbated by COVID with this wait and see every 3 months attitudes. So you can't do a whole annual plan. And so your jobs become even more complex. Okay, so to save you time, and by the way, guys, this is a work in progress. We're starting to code it. I'll show you where we're coding it. We're going to build up more and more as we go along, and it'll be in your Telmar and your clear decisions. Okay, and I'm going to give you some examples of target market identification to a day in the life. Okay, so also from discussions with media planners in the previous fusion, you don't know where this data source is and what was the fieldwork period. So we've coded on the coding tree on the left there, you can see own codes, you can see it. We say CPS and we say DCS and we say TAMS. So you can see the solution. Okay, and please bear in mind, you need to look at the sample and the methodology. Some DCS questions should only be looked at in the online universe. So please bear that in mind. And also the questions are asked, like for instance, TV viewing is asked in PAMS, DCS, and TAMS. And obviously TAMS is the way to go. And this is another beauty about Fusion. It links directly to your ratings because it comes from your ratings engine. It comes from TAMS. Okay. Target marketing identification. The single most important thing of the foundation of any advertising. Now, when I was at Varsity, it was just the 4 Ps: product, price, promotion, and place. Now there's 7, and in some models there even more. But a product or a brand-defined target market will give you an 18 to 15% better return than a demographically defined one. And so, yes, that's what we always push, and that's why we've got over 2,000 brands. Okay, but there is SEMs in there if you want standardized performance. Okay, so as I said, we're setting these up in Telmar and Clear Decisions. And they'll be under own codes there. And all you'll do is click on any of those target markets if you want the 20 groups, the 10 groups, 1 to 5, the super groups, or the mean. And you drop your brand in. So we're trying to do media planning by the numbers just to help you identify your target markets. Those are all being coded as we speak. Okay, I'm not going to get into too much detail with examples, but you can see there, you'll be able to set the index at 105. So there, like for cell C, you can see that's an up market. MTN is lower, middle, and Vodacom's got a straddle, and that's a problem when you've got to look at 2 parts. We are in the process of getting Telmar and Nielsen to code what's called Predictor Plus, which is the index multiplied by the percentage. And then you get much better target market definitions. And you could see, like with cell C, your center of gravity would be 2001. And then you can see the cascading effect of how your ratings go on either side. Okay, this is the most exciting part, and I wish I could have spoken for 20 minutes on this. In 2019, you saw how the morning had become reading and the evening was viewing. Look at and there was quite a big section of printed and online listening. This year, moving on to 2020, we've seen incredible patterns. And remember, this DCS, and by the way, guys, this is not a currency. This is just an indication. This was done in July and August. So it was done in lockdown 3 and August was lockdown 2. And it's fun. COVID has fundamentally changed the way we work. You can have a lot of fun playing with this, because you'll see what's happened is the workday has shifted. Before 9, this graph adds up to 100%, but the audiences are all down. And I think what's happening is with the work from home, you're busy sorting out the kids, doing this, doing that. Your workday only starts earlier, but guess what? It goes right until 10 o'clock. And this is where the whole workplace thing is changing, and it's changed fundamentally. The printed reading is way down, but the online radio listening is way up. And overall television is way up on last year. And I did the same. I started watching IPL games, because you say I'm working all day from home. I can watch the odd IPL game. So it's changed, and you can see that in the DCS figures. Okay. And just to finish off with, where are we going? Because that's the beauty about a fusion. You can just add on new studies. So fusion phase 2, we have been working with the IIB for a number of months. The Nielsen data scientists in Budapest have already played around and evaluated a July pilot extract. And this project is ongoing. And so we can add in those 68 million unique browsers and give you detailed longitudinal data for digital as well. As I mentioned, the MAMS mindsets and attitude, we have just come out of field with 1,000 sample that we did with Insights Consulting, and it's got over 100 statements, including values, motivations, aspirations, lifestyle, health, personality types, shopping habits in COVID, and you'll see how COVID has acted as a catalyst for online shopping, religious trust in medias. We put in hobbies, alcohol, smoking. You could even see that 7% of people admit online to taking recreational drugs. So there's a mind of a wealth of information that you can get there, and we'll be releasing that report on its own in late November, and then we'll fuse it later on next year. Okay, so that was a brief overview of the practical side of things, and I'll now hand back to Josephine.
Thank you, Pete. So that was incredibly fascinating. Wow, I think we might have run out of time for questions, but we do have a couple of questions that have been coming through on the chat box. I see that people have been responding. We will, over the next few days, be able to respond to you on across our platforms. So anything we didn't get a chance to respond to today, then please let me know. But Terry, I believe you and Pete have been chatting to people on the chat box. I did receive a few from social media, so I'm just gonna address a couple of those. But in essence, I want to also confirm that the Fusion dataset is going to be available across all the Software Bureau from Friday. There will be follow-up workshops for those of you that want to deeper dive into the data, because I know that's a question on everyone's lips. And yes, please follow our communication channels over the next few days. So anything we don't get to today, we'll cover then. But Pete, I have a question for you, I think, and we have a question for Jonathan. Let me just bring that up quickly, because we've been getting these live online as well while we've been talking to one another. Jonathan, if you're there, we've been given a question. What is the criteria that a research study would need to be integrated with the Fusion 2020 data? E.g., is there a minimum sample size? Any linking questions that are required? What would be the cost of fusing an independent study with Fusion 2020? I suppose that's for us to answer. We understand that while the answer is probably how long is a piece of string and dependent on numerous variables, is there some sort of guideline that you could provide? Jonathan?
Yes, thanks, Josephine. So the key here is really, and as I mentioned, the great thing about the fusions is that they are very flexible. The key here is the points that I had made around the completeness and the congruence of the data. So when you think about the the demographic characteristics or the attributes of the people, that's really the critical thing that we need to look at in terms of our ability to combine two data sets. Is there an overlap, not necessarily in the primary thing that you're measuring, but in the attributes and the characteristics around that information that you can get from each of the different data sets. So you're right, it's a little bit of a tricky question to answer specifically. There's no one answer. We would really need to look at the data sets and again, determine the statistical significance of all of those potential linking variables that we would need.
Thanks, Jonathan. Pete, I think, were you trying to give me a question there? No? Okay. There was another one. Okay, the invitation to the event makes reference to Fusion 2020 becoming the de facto media planning tool. Are there plans to cover outdoor and cinema? Well, yes, we are. We're open to collaborations with all JICs. And in fact, we've been in preliminary discussions with out of home. So watch this space. You know, we're all about collaboration. We'd like to invite as many JICs that would like to participate in ensuring that we make this data available as much as we can. So I think I'm going to wrap up there. As I say, other questions and other content, please follow our channels over the next few days. We'll respond to as much of that as we can. But in conclusion, we at the PRC and the BRC continue to keep at the forefront of this trend, and we'll keep you updated and informed and with continued access through all of our partner software bureaus. In closing, allow me to thank all of our speakers, but especially Jonathan for waking up before dawn to join us from Florida today to share that fascinating look into the methodology. It is indeed compelling and also encouraging to see that South Africa is shoulder to shoulder with other markets throughout the world in the adoption of Fusion. And thank you to the industry for an unprecedented number of attendees joining us today. May you remain safe and sane as this extraordinary year comes to an end. And when 2020 disappears into the rear view, may 2021 be a better year for you, for our sector, and for the world. Thank you, everybody.